There's no better time to plant trees and shrubs than late summer, early autumn. Whether you're bringing in a new specimen or moving a mature tree, it's all covered in this Q&A session, filmed for the Telegraph Online. This garden looks very strange. It's very much work in progress. But what it's all about is it was just a mass of comfrey and a massive ivy here. It's a sort of rather overgrown area. In front of me over there, I've got some large hazel trees. Now I'm going to cut those down. I'm going to coppice them down and let them grow up again. And that will give this area a lot more light. And having removed the ivy and the comfrey, I'm going to turn it into a rose meadow with some topiary, which has just been given to me. And so the whole transformation of this area will add a lot more horticultural interest, and it will allow me to grow some lovely shrub roses. Now, many people submitted a question in advance as to what is the best time to move plants. Now, when nurseries actually lift plants for planting bare root plants or root ball plants, they usually do it towards the end of November. Because of climate change, it's got later and later each year. But actually, I read some research about 20 years ago from the States that said that one of the best times to move plants is actually between August and September. And that's because you can move them, and provided you can put shade netting or you can protect them from the sun if it turns very hot, they will actually get going. Their roots will get down into the soil while the soil's still quite warm. And so they'll be growing away before the winter commences. So when we get the very dry spells the following spring, they'll be already on their own roots pretty much. And since I read that, I've been doing that all the time, and I find it is really invaluable. Now here, I've got a lovely little root tree, little root bush. Now this I was left over from a job, and I put it in my hoarding border. I have a hoarding border where I plant things that I haven't got a space in the garden at that moment, or I want to grow them on because they're quite small from plants. And so you can see it came with these netting bags on, which a lot of root balled plants do, and you actually plant them in the bag. But you can see since I've had it, the roots have grown nicely through the bag. And so you might think, well, it's a sunny day, it's September, it's going to dry out surely, but I take precaution. So what I always do is I gently just drop them in a bowl of a bucket of water. Now, often if I'm moving something huge, I'll either fill a barrow, I've got a bigger barrow than this full of water, and I soak them in that, or I've got a massive tank, which I also use, provided you can lift it into the tank. Because when you drop it in the water, you'll find lots of air bubbles will come out, because it will have been quite dry probably in the garden at this time of year. The air bubbles come out, the water can really soak it. And then I'm going to plant it here. Now, what is this? You think, what is this contraption here? But I've got this little standard yew tree that was given to me. Now, I could have planted it in the ground, but it's actually got quite a small stem, and I thought it would look a bit dumpy, and I thought I'd rather have the height, I'd rather have it higher. So I've cut off the bottom of the plastic pot, and so the yew will now root into the ground. Now, I don't like the look of the plastic pot particularly, so I'm going to actually just hide it, and you can see I partially planted its mates all the way around the edge, and then I'm going to put this one in front. Now, so I'll dig my hole, just move the barrow a wee bit. I'll dig my hole, and now when you dig a hole, in the olden days when you read gardening books, they used to say dig a massive big hole, fill it with lots of rich compost, pop the plant in and backfill with lovely compost and rich soil. But now research has shown that you really don't want to do that, because what happens is then the plant's roots stay in that lovely little rich nest of a pocket, and they don't go out into the surrounding soil, and that's what you want them to do. So I've dug it really just that size. Now, having done that, I'm now going to fill the hole with water. Now that seems strange, but that soil will be quite dry down below, and I want the roots to follow the water down. I'm not putting any compost or any fertiliser in it at the moment at all. I won't do that. Now also, if you dig a very deep soil, any soil below about 450 mil so about that sort of amount. Because there's very little air at that depth, the soil becomes anaerobic, it has no oxygen. And then you get toxic gases given off like methane, which actually kill the plants. So they found that's actually detrimental. Now, if you filled the soil pocket with water and after an hour it didn't drain away, you would know that you had a drainage problem. And one thing that you hate more than anything is to have wet roots in the winter. It's very good to have moisture during the growing season. If you water them, they will grow really fast. They have a reputation for being slow, but if they have water in the growing season, they will really motor on. So on occasions when we have planted yew trees on badly drained soils, we plant them on a slight mound, about 150 millimetres above the surrounding ground. We planted a mass of quite large topiary specimens on one job, and they were all planted just proud of the land, and that really helped them establish really well. So we've got the hole, it's got water in it which is draining away nicely, and then we lift this plant that's been soaked in a bucket of water and we just position it in. Now when you position a plant, obviously you can face it any way you want, and when you're doing show gardens and things, you make sure that it's faced in the most attractive way. Now here I've got the side branches spreading out to either side, which is what I want because I'm trying to hide this black plastic pot. I mean, it looks very strange at the moment because you can see the black plastic pot, but in a year you won't be able to see any sight of it. So, and then I'm just going to tread it in lightly. A lot of people stamp and push and things like that, but I don't want to squeeze the air out of the soil. I want good contact between the roots and the soil, but I don't want to over egg it and make it too compacted. Soil is a living element. It's got thousands and millions of microbes in there. Now, because we've actually cut off some of the roots when we lifted it, we all have lost tiny root hairs and things like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cut some of the top. Now, we did have a question here which related to this, and the question was, is it better to cut the top of a plant before you move it or after you move it? And really, as long as you do it, it doesn't matter too much when. If I'm moving a rose, which is a large prickly bush, I'll probably cut it right down to maybe a foot or so high, because it's actually quite difficult to dig around a rose if you're getting pricked and stuff and caught up on the rose, so I'll do it before. This is quite straightforward. I'm going to cut it back, and always when you're going to cut plants, and I want this to form basically a low hedge, it will come just up to here and just go around the edge. It will form a plinth to the pot, and so I will just cut. I want the plant to grow that way, so I'm just going to cut those side ones off just as you would if it was a hedge, because you want, everywhere you cut will encourage new growth. Okay, and what happens when you cut a plant after you've moved it is you've moved lots of root hairs, you've broken lots of tiny root hairs, so it's got less roots than when it was growing in the hoarding border. So therefore I want it to have less shoots, so you address the root to shoot ratio, and you want to have as good a roots to shoots as you had before. So by removing some of the foliage, you are effectively making more roots compared to shoots, and that helps. Now, if we had a heat wave and the sun came pouring down, I'd probably get some shade netting, some of that green shade netting, and I would put it over it. But before I did that, I will water it in, and that's important. You know, we've watered the hole, we've soaked the root ball, and now we'll water it in. And with watering, because it's not established, so I'll just watch this plant for any sign of stress over the next 2 or 3 weeks until the weather really starts to become more autumnal, and I'll make sure that I maybe soak it once a week. I wouldn't do it more than that because I don't want the roots up on the surface. I'll just give it maybe 1 2-gallon can, and this is a 2-gallon can. I'll get 1 2-gallon can once a week if it's hot and dry, maybe every 2 weeks if it's less dry. So we had some other questions on moving plants, and one was from Tom, and he said, I had a lovely rose given to me by my mother, and we are moving house. I really don't want to lose this rose. My mother is no longer with me, and I want to keep the rose as memory of her. And I think that's a lovely question. And many people say that roses are really difficult to move, but I dispute that. I remember one rose that there was work done to the house. It was a really lovely climbing rose. The builders came along, dug it up, chucked it into a ditch. And then the owner came back and said, where's my beautiful rose? And so about 5 months later, it was in the ditch in the field. This was early spring, and got the rose and planted it, and it grew away. So roses are quite easy to move. Any plant, when you move it, it does depend hugely on what type of soil you're on. If you go to Boskoop in Holland, where they have all the wonderful trade wholesale nurseries, it's grown on beautiful reclaimed soil. It's beautiful peaty soil, very deep. And so all the roots stay nicely together in a root ball. If those same plants were grown on a very thin, dry, brashy, stony soil, those roots would go all the way through, out, down, down, searching for water, and that would be much more difficult to lift. So there is that variable, but generally roses are easy to move, and they do move very well. I mean, when they lift them commercially, when they lift bare root roses, they'll lift them sort of beginning of October, and then they'll send them out at the end of October. They will remove the leaves if they haven't already dropped off, because they're of no use then. And they will have lifted them with a machine. So you'll have about 150 millimetres, sort of 6 inches of roots. There might be 3 or 4 fangs. It's not a taproot, there's sort of 3 or 4 fangs, and they might go sideways, they might go down or whatever. And there'll be no leaves on the top. The leaves will have been cut right down. And I do think it is worth cutting the top down to about 300 mil, something like that. And I would move one now, definitely, if I was going to move one, because again, you can get them planted and you can get them watered in, and their roots can start growing away. And I know people who have moved sort of 20-year-old rose gardens, and they've moved them and they've all done really well. So there are some plants that are difficult to move, but I wouldn't classify rose as one. Daphnes are notorious for being difficult to move, but actually I think if you take care, and that hasn't been in the ground for many, many years, I think you'll probably get away with it. You just bear in mind you've removed a whole load of roots when you've dug it up invariably, and so therefore you must just give it more water and things to start with. And when root pruning is quite handy, maybe not with Daphne, but when I bought bare root box liners, so you get box plants, and you often get little box liners about 6 inches big with maybe 300 mil of trailing roots. And so it's quite difficult to plant something with 300 mil trailing roots, so I'll just snip off about half and they grow really well. And that is worth knowing. If you're struggling to lift a shrub and it's got 1 or 2 really deep roots, don't bother to dig down to Australia to get those roots, just cut them off. It will make it much easier, and it will stimulate the plant to grow new roots. And just to show how you can move plants in hot weather, there was some lovely hydrangea, Arborescens Annabelle, which were planted in a garden. The owners were moving. They'd been in there about 2 or 3 years. It was July, very sunny, and I had to get them out before the new people moved in. And actually, I dug them out with a nice big root ball. I brought them back here. I watered them in well, and they're absolutely fine. I just watched them. I put some shade netting on when it was really hot. I watered them weekly with a decent amount. Now, if they'd started to wilt, I would have just cut off the flowers, because when any plant is in flower, then obviously it can't send its roots out to find more water. It actually stops its root growth generally. So you can always do that, remove the flowers, which helps reduce the stress, and that helps it on. But in this case, I didn't have to. Right, we have another question that was pre-submitted, and this was from Sally. She said, I've got a lovely beech tree, which I'm very fond of, but it's in the wrong place. Now, we often do that with trees, don't we? We often get them in the wrong place. I'm loath to lose it. Can I move it? It's about 30 years old. Now, interestingly enough, we moved a beech tree, a large beech tree, probably about that age, maybe a wee bit older, we did a tree house at Chelsea, and we wanted a big tree that we could move in and make the tree house in. It was difficult to find one, and we couldn't find one from a nursery that had been prepared, but we did find one on the farm next door. And so we employed a tree spade, and you can get these big tree spades, and they're often mounted with a power takeoff on a machine, and they have two big blades that are sort of shaped like a big cone, and they just sort of cut around the root ball. And that beech tree, although it had never been prepared, you know, because often on nurseries they root prune them, they undercut them to keep the root system nice and contained. None of that had gone on before. It was just a tree on a farm. And we moved it into Chelsea. So we lifted it in something like November, kept it on the nursery, put it in a big sort of container and put some nice compost around it and wrapped it. And then we moved it into Chelsea in May, by which time it was shooting up nicely into leaf. So you do get many instances now of people moving really large trees, and you can do that. Obviously you need access to these machines. If it was smaller plant than that, so if it was something like, I don't know, a 5 or 10-year-old plant that you wanted to move and you didn't think you could do it in 1 year, you can always just cut round half the root ball with a spade 1 year. I would probably do it now and backfill it with soil. And then the next year, at the same time, you can cut round the other half, backfill it with soil, water them a bit extra. And then the year you want to move it, you come and dig underneath it and you lift it. And that obviously lessens the impact. You're only disturbing half the tree roots at a time. Well, really not even half, because you've got the ones underneath as well, and that just lessens the blow. So I always think if something's really in the wrong place, you really like it, just have a go, and that will work really well. So don't be timid, but do it earlier rather than later. And that beautiful little quince tree, that Sidonia oblonga, Serbian gold. Serbian gold is most important because Serbian gold gets much less quince leaf blight than the other quinces. I moved that a couple of years ago, and you can see it's a lovely natural shape. It's very healthy. I don't bother to water it now, even though we've had a really dry summer. So go ahead, start moving. All keen gardeners love moving plants. We often get them in the wrong place initially, or sometimes they do much better or much worse than we thought. And so we can't always get it right. And what's more, we like to refresh areas and change the planting around or reorganise it. So we spend a lot of time playing musical chairs with our plants in our gardens. And I think that's the whole fun of gardening. In the next of this mini-series, I'll be showing how I saved hundreds of pounds by taking blight-resistant box cuttings. Very easy and very rewarding.